Hi guys, and welcome back to our endocrine system lesson. This is part 2. So we left off with a basic review of the overall endocrine system and the basics of hormones. So what we're going to talk about in this lesson are these specific organs. And so we're going to get more into the anatomy of the organ, the location in the body, the function of the hormone, and the effects that these hormones have. So this is a nice diagram that shows you the location of each of our endocrine system glands. Up in the brain, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and there is also the pineal gland. Today, we are going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And then in the next lesson, we will go over the rest of these glands, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, the thymus, the pancreas, your adrenal glands, the ovaries and testes, and we will not be talking about the placenta, but during pregnancy, the placenta does release hormones, so it does act as an endocrine organ. So we learned in the nervous system that the pituitary gland is the small pea-sized gland that is found on the underside of the brain. So its location is anteriorly located and it's inferior to that hypothalamus. It actually hangs by a stalk called the infundibulum from that hypothalamus, and it's protected by the sphenoid bone of the cranium. And it sits right in this location here that is called the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The pituitary gland has 2 lobes. It has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is actually made up of glandular tissue. So when we look at it underneath a microscope, we're going to see that simple cuboidal epithelium that functions to secrete substances. Versus the posterior lobe, when we look at that underneath the microscope, we're actually going to see unmyelinated neurons. Since the anterior pituitary gland is glandular tissue, it is also referred to as the adenohypophysis, while the posterior pituitary, since it's made out of neurotissue, it's also known as the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis means pituitary gland. So it's neural pituitary and glandular pituitary. The pituitary gland is often referred to as the master gland because it controls many of the other glands within the body. What we're looking at here is a cross-section of the brain, and you can see these glands as well as the skull bones. So the hypothalamus is located right here, and you can see it highlighted in this image right here. Then the infundibulum is going to connect the pituitary gland that's here to that hypothalamus. So that's going to be located right here. And then you can actually see the sella tunica of the sphenoid bone located right here. And this is an MRI showing those same structures. You can see the hypothalamus here between these blue arrows. And then in between the green arrow that's pointing at that infundibulum. And then you can see between those red arrows, we have the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus have a very interconnected relationship. The pituitary gland will control and release hormones influencing other glands of the body. However, the hypothalamus is going to be the one who regulates which hormone the pituitary gland secretes. So there are two types of hormones that will be secreted. They will either be a releasing hormone that will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone, or it will be an inhibiting hormone, which will inhibit the pituitary gland from releasing a hormone. And those hormones will travel from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland through the hypophyseal portal system, which is located right here, traveling through that infundibulum. So the hypothalamus is going to secrete 6 different hormones that are going to influence the activity of the anterior pituitary and what hormones that anterior pituitary releases. So those hormones could be gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, or somatostatin. And those hormones that are produced here in the hypothalamus will travel through the blood to that anterior pituitary. And so what goes through this stalk and creates what's called the let me use this laser. What creates the hypophyseal portal tract are these blood vessels in this portal venule. Typically, blood flow goes from an artery to a capillary, then to a vein. But in this case, we're going to have blood flow from an artery to a capillary to a vein. So we have an artery to a capillary to a vein, and then to a capillary again before it will enter that vein to leave the area. So this is called a portal system. And what connects the portal system of the anterior pituitary to the hypothalamus are these 2 venules here. The posterior pituitary makes up about 1/4 of the pituitary gland, but it's not a true gland because it's actually made up of nervous tissue. So there are nerve bodies that are located within the hypothalamus. And the axons from the nerve bodies will pass down through the stalk and into the posterior pituitary. Where those tracks go through the stalk forms the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Please don't get that confused with the hypophyseal portal tract. I know they sound similar, but it's unfortunately just one of those things that we have to know. So the axons going through that tract will end up in the posterior pituitary. And that will stimulate the pituitary gland to release the hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary. And then that stored hormone will get released into the blood. So the hypothalamus, when we went into the nervous system last class in 201, there were different nucleus that we talked about, but 2 that should have been mentioned to you are the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus, because we are going to retouch on those here in the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus will have these nuclei. And the paraventricular nucleus, these are neuron cells that will actually produce oxytocin in the hypothalamus. And then the oxytocin will travel down that stalk through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract and into the posterior pituitary gland. There, that hormone will be stored until it's ready to be released by the body. The supraoptic nucleus, this is the optic chiasm that's located here, so it fits that this is called the supraoptic nucleus. This nucleus will produce antidiuretic hormone. And it will function the same way. That antidiuretic hormone will be produced in the supraoptic nucleus within the hypothalamus, and then that hormone will travel down the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract into the posterior lobe, where it will be stored until it's ready to be released. And then targets of those hormones, targets of oxytocin, are going to be the uterus and the mammary glands, and antidiuretic hormone will have a target of the kidneys. When we are in class, we are going to look at the pituitary gland underneath the microscope and view some of the histology. So if you look at this image here, we can see the infundibulum. And that infundibulum, the tissue almost looks like it's continuous with that posterior pituitary. So if we were to zoom in at a higher magnification, what we're going to notice are unmyelinated nerves and nervous tissue versus the anterior pituitary. This will be the darker stained portion of the pituitary gland. We're going to zoom in and see a higher magnification, but we will see, you can actually see one right here, there is a layer of simple cuboidal epithelium that will release their substance right into the bloodstream. So when the posterior pituitary gland does release antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. But that is going to cause water retention in the kidneys. It's going to decrease urine production and prevent dehydration. It's also going to act as a neurotransmitter called vasopressin. And vasopressin causes vasoconstriction or constriction of blood vessels, and that will in turn increase blood pressure. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions and promotes milk production or release of breast milk. But oxytocin is also released in a surge during sexual arousal and orgasm. It promotes feelings of sexual satisfaction and emotional bonding between partners. And then it will also stimulate labor contractions during childbirth and that flow of milk during lactation. It also is what is thought to promote that emotional bonding between a mother and an infant, or a father and a child. When they are holding that child, it promotes that emotional bonding. When it comes to antidiuretic hormone, if you just think about what we know about diuretics cause kidneys to release more water into the urine. So things that are diuretics are things like caffeine or alcohol. Usually when people consume those substances, they have to urinate more often. And that's because more water is being added to the urine. So antidiuretic hormone does the opposite of that. It's going to keep water in and lower the urine volume. So it is secreted by the posterior pituitary, and things that are going to stimulate the production of antidiuretic hormone to retain water are going to be things like dehydration or hypotension, that's low blood pressure, or low blood osmolarity. If you haven't learned what osmolarity is, but that's basically how much water is in your blood compared to all the other stuff, like all the sugars and salts and everything else. So if you have low blood osmolarity, then that means that there's not enough water in your blood. So some effects of this antidiuretic hormone when it comes in contact with the kidneys is going to be water retention. Water will be removed from the urine and put back into the blood. They can also, antidiuretic hormone can also target your sudoriferous glands. If you recall, your sudoriferous glands are your sweat glands. So antidiuretic hormone can tell your sweat glands to keep the water in and not to sweat. And then there's also going to be a target of your arterioles. So with the arterioles, antidiuretic hormone is going to function by constricting those arteries in vasoconstriction. And by retaining water and putting more water in the blood and constricting the diameter of our blood vessels, we're going to increase our blood pressure. And so some disorders of antidiuretic hormone is diabetes insipidus. This is different than the blood sugar diabetes. In this instance, the individual who has diabetes insipidus cannot make use, either they cannot make or they cannot use antidiuretic hormone. So your pituitary gland is essentially considered to be the master gland. It will regulate all of the processes or hormones that the other glands secrete. But the pituitary gland is kind of more like middle management. They may run the store, but they still have a corporate office that they have to check in with. And the corporate office is essentially the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this region here that's located just above the pituitary gland, and it's about the size of an almond. The main function of the hypothalamus is to control which hormones the pituitary gland secretes. And it can do this either by hormonal control or neural. And this is going to allow for functions like controlling the brain and stem and spinal cord. In those areas, if you recall from our nervous system, that's where the emotional response is regulated, body temperature, hunger, thirst, regulation of the sleep-wake cycles. The hypothalamus is going to secrete 6 hormones that can regulate or control the anterior pituitary. 4 of those hormones are releasing hormones, and 2 of those hormones are inhibiting hormones. Thyrotropin releasing hormone will promote the secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone and prolactin. Corticotropic releasing hormone will promote the secretion of ACTH, or adenocorticotropic hormone. The gonadotropin releasing hormone will promote the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone, and that's supposed to be luteinizing hormone. That should be LH, not LS. And growth hormone releasing hormone will promote the secretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. The 2 inhibiting hormones are prolactin inhibiting hormone, which will inhibit the secretion of prolactin, and somatostatin, which inhibits the secretion of both growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. And there's a really good table in the McGraw-Hill textbook. It's table 17.3 in this unit. Each hormone produced by the anterior pituitary gland will have an effect on another gland in the body. So for example, thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid to produce thyroxine, while adrenocorticotropic hormone will stimulate the adrenal glands. Growth hormone will have an impact on the growth of muscle, bone, cartilage, fat. It will also have an impact on the liver, which we'll talk about. A melanocyte stimulating hormone will stimulate the melanocytes within your skin, hair, and the iris of your eyes to produce melanin, which is a pigment. Prolactin will stimulate the production of milk. And then there's the gonadotrophins. Gonadotrophins will have two different flavors. There is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. They're both gonadotrophins. Luteinizing hormone will stimulate the release of sex hormones, and follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the production of sperm or egg cells. So here we have another nice diagram where you can see the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And if we zoom in on that region, you can see that there are the hypothalamus, the neurons that secrete these different hormones, and they will travel through a capillary bed and into the anterior pituitary. And they will travel through that hypophyseal portal tract into the anterior pituitary. And then the anterior pituitary will release a hormone. If it releases thyroid stimulating hormone, that will go to the thyroid. If adrenocorticotropin is released, that will go to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. The prolactin will go to the mammary glands. Growth hormone will go to those bones and tissues like cartilage and muscle. The gonadotrophins will go to the ovaries and testes. When it comes to the growth hormone, that is actually produced by specific cells called somatotrophs. So it kind of makes sense that the hormone can be referred to as somatotropin. It's not really referred to as that much anymore. But when you look at the word soma, that prefix, soma means body. So this hormone is going to have widespread effects on many different body tissues. It's going to do a lot of promotion of growth of cartilage, bone, fat, and muscle. And it will play a crucial role in the final body size. Because when it is released, what happens is typically the growth hormone will travel to the liver, and it will stimulate the liver to release insulin-like growth factors. And it's the insulin-like growth factors that will then be released and travel through the blood to these target tissues, saying, hey, we need you to grow more. We want you to get bigger. So we will start to see mitosis and cellular differentiation in those target tissues. The actions of growth hormone when it does reach its target site is going to be an increase in protein synthesis because we want to get bigger. So we're going to have to create more proteins and increase transcription and translation so we can make more cells and we can grow larger. So since proteins are made out of amino acids, that's going to cause the cells to increase amino acids from the environment around them. And because we're wanting to make proteins, that's also going to then suppress the breakdown of proteins in catabolism. There's also going to be an effect on lipid metabolism. Adipocytes are going to be stimulated to start to break down or catabolize fats. And we're going to see what's called the protein sparing effect, because typically the body will use proteins as a source of energy. However, we are trying to get bigger, and we need proteins. So instead of breaking down proteins for that energy, we will start seeing fatty acid metabolism and use for energy instead of using those proteins. And we'll see the same kind of effect in carbohydrates because the brain can only have glucose and something called a ketone body as a source of fuel. It's very, very picky. But your body tissues, they can use things like fatty acids. So we're going to save that glucose to be used by the brain in the glucose sparing effects. And fatty acids will get moved so body tissues can use the fatty acids and save the glucose for the brain. This will also stimulate the liver because the liver stores glucose in a form called glycogen. And so we will start to see the liver being stimulated to release some of that glucose that it has stored. So in the target tissues, we're going to see specific actions from growth hormone. In the skeletal muscles, our cartilage and our bone, we are going to start to see anabolic metabolism. So anabolism is when you take something small and you make something bigger out of them. So we take the building blocks of amino acids and monosaccharides and fatty acids, and we build substances from them. So we'll see protein synthesis. We will start to see cartilage being formed and matrix formation. We will also see cells grow and proliferate. Within the liver, we are going to see what's called glycogenolysis. Lysis, that suffix means to break apart. So we're going to start to break apart those glycogen molecules that are stored in the liver and release those pieces of glucose back into the bloodstream, raising the blood glucose levels. And what we're going to see is a diabetogenic effect that kind of mimics diabetes or type 2 diabetes because we are increasing our blood glucose levels. In our fat cells or our adipose tissue, we are going to see lipolysis. So this is the breakdown of fat. And that fat will start to be mobilized for transport, and cells of the body will shift to fatty acid metabolism to make the ATP energy that they need, once again saving that glucose for the brain. So some factors that will increase the secretion of growth hormone are going to be things like hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, or if we have a very low growth hormone blood levels. And growth hormone is actually secreted in your sleep. So if you go into a deep, long sleep, we're going to increase the amount of growth hormone that is produced. And then also, if there's any kind of vigorous exercise or trauma, some stresses that are impacting the health of our cells or possibly causing them injury, we're going to want to replace them. And so we're going to want to stimulate mitosis, and growth hormone will do so. So growth hormone is secreted in the highest amounts during the first 2 hours of your sleep. And adolescents need more growth hormone, and children need more growth hormone than adults because they're still actively growing. So just to put some numbers out there for you, adolescents produce about 6 nanograms per mil of growth hormone versus as we age and an adult, we'll have about 1.5 nanograms per mil. And as we get older, we're going to see a decrease in our protein synthesis and collagen production. So we're going to start to see more aging of tissues and wrinkling of the skin simply because we are producing less growth hormone. So those tissues are not stimulated to regenerate. And these numbers down here, they are just to reiterate that in somebody who's around 30, their adult body is about 10% bone, 20% fat, and like 30% muscle. But at somebody who's at about 75, they're only going to have 8% bone, so 2% decrease, but only 15% muscle. So that number is going to drastically decrease. And then we're going to have a 40% fat. So the fat percentage doubles because we're just simply not making their growth hormone like we did when we were younger. So there are some disorders when it comes to growth hormone. If there is hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood, that means there's not enough secretion of growth hormone. We're going to see what's called pituitary dwarfism. And that's a different type of dwarfism than what most people think of with dwarfism. In pituitary dwarfism, they're proportional. They don't have the shorter limbs. They look proportionate. They're just very tiny because they haven't had enough growth hormone produced when they were younger. Versus gigantism, we're going to see the same proportions, but we're just going to see much larger proportions than we see in the dwarfism because there's too much or there is hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood. And that is different than acromegaly. Acromegaly is going to result after the growth plates of the bones have closed. So the bones can no longer grow, but the pituitary gland is going to be secreting too much growth hormone. So we're going to still see growth of those tissues of like the cartilage and the muscles. So we'll see like an enlarged nose and a prominent forehead and enlarged lips and tongue. But the bones are already done growing because the growth plates are closed. So the bone won't be able to grow with the rest of the tissues. And we will quickly go over the rest of these. So other hormones produced by the anterior pituitary include prolactin, and those are secreted by lactotrophs, and they are going to stimulate and maintain the milk production after childbirth. The adrenal corticotrophic hormone is going to be secreted by corticotrophs, and that, if you break down the word, don't be afraid of it. Adrenal means adrenal glands. Cortico means the cortex. And trophic means like to seek out or to find. So this hormone is literally trying to find the cortex of the adrenal glands. So they're going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. And those are those fight or flight responses. Thyroid stimulating hormone will be secreted by thyrotrophs, and those are going to influence growth and activity of the thyroid gland. The final two are gonadotropic hormones that regulate hormonal activity of the gonads. So, follicle stimulating hormone is a hormone that can be secreted, and in females who have ovaries, those ovaries will be stimulated, which is how it gets its name, follicle stimulating hormone. So it will stimulate the follicles in the ovaries. But in males, they have testes instead of ovaries. So in males, this will stimulate sperm development in the testes. So egg development in the ovaries and sperm development in the testes. Luteinizing hormone, that for females is going to trigger ovulation, and that will release the egg in females, while in males, it's going to stimulate testosterone production. And that is the end. We will see you again for the rest of the endocrine glands.